Hi and welcome everyone to the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. This is the last event in the Michaelmas term. My name is Raphael Fazell and I am the Executive Director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Some of you may be here for the first time, so I'm just going to say a few words about the format of the Talking Animals series. We will start with a presentation by our speaker that will last anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll then have the rest of the time for discussion together. The event will end at around 6:30 p.m. UK time. Now, everyone's warmly invited to participate in the discussion, and if you'd like to come in, make a comment perhaps, or ask a question, please do so. And please, if you can, use the raise hand function, which you can find on the bottom of your Zoom app. That will then allow me to go through the different raised hands and allow you to ask your questions directly to our speaker. So it'll make for a nicer discussion, I think. If you cannot locate the raise hand function, or perhaps you're traveling and you're just calling in, if you'd like to use the chat function instead, that's fine too. You can type your comment or question into the chat as well. But the more people who can sort of comment and participate directly, the better. Until the discussion, I will keep all the microphones muted so we can listen to the presentation. We are recording this talk, and we'll then switch off the recording for the discussion. Okay, with this out of the way, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. We've got Peter Niesen with us, who's a professor of political theory at the University of Hamburg, where he's been based since 2013. Before that, Peter was professor of political theory and the history of ideas at TU Darmstadt and a member of the Frankfurt-based Normative Order Cluster of Excellence from 2007. His dissertation and habilitation were both from Goethe-Universität Frankfurt, and he has held visiting appointments at UCL, LSE, Southampton, and Harvard. Now, Peter, as many of you, I think, will know, has been working in a number of different fields. Some of you may be familiar with his leading work in constitutional and political theory. For instance, this year, he's just published the article 2 Cheers for Lost Sovereignty Referendums, Campaigns for Independence and the Pouvoir Constituant Mixed, which was published in the German Law Review and which I recently used in one of my own papers. It's a great article. He's also written a chapter on Bentham's Cosmopolitan Constitutionalism, which came out with Cambridge University Press this year. But perhaps even more relevantly for our purposes, Peter's also been working on animal rights. Specifically this year, for instance, he's published a piece, Animal Agriculture and the Labor Turn. And this came out in a special issue of the journal Politics and Animals. We're delighted to have Peter with us today for his presentation entitled Which All Subjected Principle for Animals. Peter, thanks so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Raphael. It's a pleasure to be here and a privilege to speak in your distinguished series. What I would like to propose to do is to read the first page of my introduction and then share the screen and walk you through the paper and walk you through the files that I brought. So the title of the paper, as you said, is Which All Subjected Principle for Animals, and it's a paper which is very much situated in what people have called the political turn in human-animal studies, which has been going on since 15 years or so, and which has been an inspiration to many authors working in the field. But at the same time, it's also polemically directed against the leading accounts in the political turn. And I will soon explain why I believe that the political turn so far has been, both politically and philosophically speaking, a halfway house. Its main proponents have suggested that animals should be awarded membership rights in polities, in societies, but have at the same time defended a moral and non-relational understanding of basic animal rights. and a more freestanding relational approach for at least those animals that are inextricably connected to interspecies practices, habitations, and ways of life, is now called for to make the political turn both theoretically more consistent and politically more attractive. And this is why I turn to the famous all-subjective principle, which is a well-known standard in the political theory of citizenship, in order to discuss criteria of the democratic inclusion for animals. Now, I will already foreshadow what I'm going to end up with, so be advised that I will settle on an interpretation of subjection as coercion, which under the all-subjective principle should trigger that animals have a say through political representatives. But I will distinguish in the course of the paper between the animal perspective on the all-subjective principle and the human perspective on the all-subjective principles, because animals will be the subjected party and humans will be those doing the subjecting. And given that the validity of the all-subjective principle as a principle that triggers democratic inclusion depends very much on attributes that we usually ascribe to humans, I will also tackle the question of which attributes in animals or humans trigger democratic inclusion under the all-subjective principle for animals. In other words, I ask which normative deficits the coercion, the subjection of animals incurs. And my argument is that in addition to animal claims from liberty and from cooperation, it is the inevitability of exercising political power in a democracy that lends credence to the inclusion of animals. Before I start and share the screen with you, I would like to point out that I've been immensely helped in developing this argument by 3 recent discussions in political theory. And because not everybody is a political theorist here tonight, I just want to point out that I'm building on discussions in the theory of justice, especially in the theory of global justice, where the all-subjected principle and the coercion relation has made great impact, but also in the political theory of immigration, where subjection has often seemed to make the difference between whether people should be included in decision-making. And finally, also in the political theory of enfranchisement between people like Abizadeh, Rainer Baubock, Robert Goodin, David Miller, and David Owen, where people have discussed the respective merits of the all-subjected and another principle called the all-affected principle. And I will also touch upon the difference in the paper. So now bear with me as I share my screen. And I hope you can see my slides now. Raphael is nodding.
This is
That's
working.
a good sign. Yeah. Okay. So ready. Now, I said that I'm situating my paper in the political turn, and there's a lot I admire in the political turn, but we need to face that the main approaches, the trailblazing approaches, all are dualistic approaches in deriving animal claims and animal rights. So first of all these important authors assert that animals have political standing, so either citizenship or denizenship, and that this political standing is derived from various kinds of relations in which we stand with animals, cooperation, subjection, and so on. So in a word, these political membership claims, they are all relationally based. They are based on relations in which we already stand with animals, and they are derived from this fact. And all these authors whose books are here on the slide, yeah, starting with Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka as the most important founders of this whole genre, but also Eva Meyer, Bernd Ladwig, and Alistair Cochrane, they assert that animals have natural rights, by which I mean innate rights that are non-relationally derived, because these are rights that animals have independently of standing in any kind of condition, in any kind of community, in any kind of relation with others or with others. Now, both of these types of claims are asserted to be enforceable claims, which I believe is deeply problematic for the second, but not for the first, because I have these three arguments against the understanding of animal natural rights as enforceable, which is that it is metaphysically controversial. That is perhaps also too strong, because it will lead to some form of legal and political egalitarianism between humans and animals that I do not want to commit to. The second argument against enforceable animal natural rights is that there is a problem with democratic legitimacy, because normally we believe that the bindingness and the legitimacy of the enforcement of legal claims comes from the fact that we as democratic citizens have had a say in the making of these enforceable laws, which are used to enforce our rights. And then finally, there's also some skepticism in the camp of the political turn authors as to the political efficacy of an appeal to animal natural rights in political campaigns for animal well-being. And so in Zoopolis, for example, already in the introduction, Donaldson and Kimlicka stress their skepticism that the negative rights that have been identified in the debate in animal ethics are politically useful, are useful in being appealed to generate legal status for animals. And so they decide they need a new approach, which is the political approach. Now, I believe that these three arguments point to the fact that it would be good if all animal claims could be derived from their political standing, and this is why I try to establish an all-subjected principle for animal. It's the first step in such an attempt. But also I believe that there are a number of hard questions that I want to evade, at least at this stage, which are controversial in political philosophy, but also in our contemporary modern societies, which concern the status of animals. By this, I do not deny that animals do have moral status, but I just don't want to commit on exactly what it is that gives animals moral status, because I believe that we should develop the rights holdership of animals from their political standing, not from their moral standing. Okay, so this is the kind of the motivation, and I should also add that one part of my motivation is that the reference to animal natural rights in the political turn makes it impossible to have a number of interesting debates which I believe should be held. And this has especially to do with discussing the legitimacy or not of our relationship to animals in animal agriculture. Raphael already alluded to this one article, which is called Animal Agriculture and the Labor Turn. And I want to treat it as an open question whether there are some agricultural uses by humans of animals that can be redeemed under the political turn, whereas the authors whom I have here on my slide, Donaldson, Kimlicka, Cochrane, Ladwig, and Eva Meyer, exclude the possibility of having legitimate agricultural practices with animals more or less from the beginning as an a priori entrance condition to debates in animal politics. And I do want to treat this as an open and substantial question, and so I don't want to anticipate an answer to it. Now, on the next slide, I just quote one influential author, Robert Goodin, who has contributed a lot to our understanding of the all-subjected principle. And of course, this is a principle that we are familiar with from democratic theory. And Goodin gives this nice take on it, saying that those on whom laws can legitimately be enforced ought to have a say in the making of those laws. And we don't have many analytic statements in democratic theory, but if we do, and this is certainly one that is a good candidate for having analytic status. Yeah, so if there is something to democracy, then it's probably because something like the all-subjective principle in this version holds. Now, what I want to claim, but not so much argue for now, but we'll be happy to discuss it in the Q&A, is that I assert that it is a fact that human laws are being enforced on animals. So take, for example, the law of averting danger. Yeah? If an animal escapes and runs on the motorway, then of course the police is within their rights to shoot the animal in order to avert danger. I think that already shows that we have some examples where laws are being enforced on animals. Also, agriculture is a realm which is regulated through and through by legislation. And so I want to say that these are laws being enforced on animals. Now, what Goodin says about the all-subjective principle, namely that one should be entitled to have a say if laws are to be legitimately enforced on one, I think we shouldn't understand too literally, because otherwise we would perhaps exclude animals from the get-go, and we should understand it in a mediated way, as we do with humans, by the way, because in modern representative democracies, humans have a say in legislation, in the making of laws, by their representatives. And this, of course, commits me to the possibility of the political representation of animals, which is a huge and interesting debate right now. But I also want to defer discussion of this to the Q&A. I just want to say that recently in the political theory of representation for humans, there have been some advances. For example, the so-called constructivist turn, which argues that representatives are more or less entrepreneurs who create and constitute the constituency whom they claim to represent, and this can be successful or unsuccessful. But it is not always necessary to understand representation as we normally do this as electoral accountability of representatives. We can discuss this in the Q&A, but what I will be saying depends on the notion of political representation of animals making some sense. Now, I have two main slides, and this next one is the first main slide for the systematic point that I'm trying to make. And this concerns a distinction that we have in Goodin between different conceptions of how to understand what subjection means in the all-subjected principle. And these three possibilities are that laws purport to bind somebody, which gives them a say in legislation, that laws materially affect somebody, which gives them a say, or finally, that laws affect somebody in a way which counts as coercive. So this is actually a special case, Goodin thinks, of number two. In short, laws coerce X, which entails that X then has a say in legislation. And I want from the outset to rule out that the first construction is a good construal for understanding an all-subjective principle for animals, because Goodin identifies the meaning of laws purporting to bind someone with the someone being legally liable to prosecution. And I think this is almost a reductio ad absurdum of subjection of animals, if we believe that if they are subjected, they should be legally liable to prosecution. All of you know that there have been examples of this in human history, and that these examples are absurd. So I want to reject the first reading of the all-subjected principle. I also believe that we should reject it if we don't, as Goodin does, identify purporting to bind and being legally liable to prosecution, because I think that animals cannot be bound by laws, which means that I don't believe laws can impose legal obligations on animals. This is because animals cannot themselves make a difference between following a norm and complying with a norm. So I believe that the normative understanding of bindingness, oughtness, is not applicable to animals here. Now, the second construal, I think, makes much more sense for animals, because I believe that laws like the one that I mentioned in the introduction, yeah, materially highly affect animals in two ways. One is that animals react to threats of sanctioning, punishment. And secondly, also, this is a notion that I take from John Rawls. A system of laws or a body of laws has pervasive impact on animals' life, which means it structures their entire existence. So what animals are, what they can do, what they can hope for, is almost totally constituted in some cases by the body of laws that animals find themselves subjected to in human-animal interspecies societies. I add one thing to this in qualifying the pervasive impact, because I believe that a certain regularity should also be referred to here. If you, for example, this is to exclude, for example, a relation of war with animals. And you know that some peoples have reconstrued human-animal relations as relations of war and try to use the language of just war for these relations. So I want to exclude warlike affectation of animals as not relevant here, but I only want to consider, so to speak, the domestic subjection of animals. Now, this is already almost complete if we consider the animal side. And one innovation, I believe, of my approach is that I construe the all-subjective principle for animals in a twofold way. I give one explanation for the perspective from animals, and I give another explanation of what subjection is supposed to mean from the human perspective. Remember, from the perspective of those who are doing the subjecting, because, as you know, this is a very one-sided relationship. And the last construal by Goodin I use to exemplify the human perspective on subjection of animals, which I believe is a coercive relationship. Now, coercion is very similar to material affectation in that it can be sufficiently exercised by a threat of sanctioning, but also by, for example, locking animals up without any threat of sanctioning, just preventing their free movement. And you know that especially agricultural animals are very often in effect imprisoned and in very narrow confinements. So I believe that we should also call this a coercive relation, although there is debate in political philosophy whether the prevention of something always counts as coercion. So this is why I add severe prevention here, and again pervasive impact, because the life chances of animals are completely determined by human beings. Now, there is a strand in the literature on humans coercing other humans, where this is all there is to it. For example, in Thomas Nagel's famous article on global justice, Nagel argues that in enforcing our borders, for example, fortified borders, we are coercing those who would like to immigrate, but who can't, who are prevented by these borders. But we do not claim political authority over them. It is a case of, as Nagel says, pure coercion. There is no normative intention involved in coercing those. And this is, I think, at least in part, an interesting idea, because we also don't want to say that we expect animals to comply. On the other hand, I believe that there is a good phenomenological case to be made that humans assume political authority over animals in arguing that whatever they regularly do to animals and what they allow other people to do to animals under laws is in some sense okay. So is in some sense justified. And this claim that I ascribe to humans in subjecting animals amounts to a claim of political authority. And I try to get some mileage out of this by saying, on the human side, the meaning of subjection of animals involves a presumption of political authority, that what we are doing to them is not unjust, that it is okay, that it is also in their interest, and so on. But that from the animal perspective itself, this is not a normative relationship, but it's a relationship of pure coercion or pure material affectation. So this is my analytical main slide. Yeah, I just explained what I assume is the best interpretation of what subjection means in the all-subjected principle. But now I'm coming to the philosophical main difficulty, which is whether under this construal, the all-subjected principle is a true principle. Because you might say, okay, so given that you've showed us this reinterpretation of the all-subjective principle, this principle is no longer analytic. And I started out by saying, the good thing or the interesting bit about the all-subjective principle is that it is a true principle, that it is an analytic principle of democratic theory. And I wonder now, is the analyticity conserved by the interpretation that I have given? And so this is now the second important slide, the second central slide. Why ought all those on whom laws can legitimately be enforced have a say in the making of those laws? And now again, we look at the literature on the ASP for humans, and there are three arguments that are being made. I think Arash Abizadeh is the most important author here, and everybody agrees with him concerning the reason why people who are subjected should have a say in the making of laws. And these three arguments are humans' autonomy, independence, and self-government. And my understanding is that we can't apply any of those categories to animals. So our endeavor might be ended here if we want to say that only autonomy, independence, and self-government preserve the validity of the all-subjective principle. But I don't want to say that. I want to present three weaker reasons, but also reasons which I believe should give animals some say, at least, in legislation. And I'd be really keen to hear what you think of these three reasons. So I believe that one of these reasons is weak and defeasible, and the other two reasons are strong and non-defeasible. I don't believe that that animal agency and negative freedom is only prima facie. It's a pro tanto reason, but it's a defeasible reason. And be happy to extemporate on that in the Q&A. But firstly, I want to say, even if we don't want to ascribe autonomy, independence, self-government to animals, and I'm following Alistair Cochrane, whose work I hugely admire here, even if we don't ascribe capacities or interests in autonomy to animals, we can ascribe them interest in agency and negative freedom. So we can ascribe them the capacity to be agents and, as Andreas Schmidt says, a non-specific interest in negative liberty. I'd be happy to explain more about this in the Q&A. Now, the second reason I believe is a strong one and should trigger a strong say in the making of laws, and that's animal cooperation with humans. And so I'm putting some weight on this Rawlsian idea of social cooperation, and that all who contribute to social cooperation must not get nothing out of it and should have a better life than they would have without this social cooperation. And one way of exemplifying social cooperation is labor. So I put these two recent book covers on the slide, which almost have the same title, Animal Labor and Animal Labor. Once the American spelling, because the book was published in Bielefeld, Germany, and once the British spelling, because the book comes from Oxford, New York. So the main difference between these two books is that the one with the chicken on the cover, but not the other one, believes that there is a legitimate use of animals in animal agriculture. So animal agriculture is one form of animal labor. This is the position of the French sociologist Jocelyn Porcher, who is in turn criticized in this other book by Charlotte Blattner, Kendra Coulter, and Will Kimlicka, Animal Labor with a U. And so I want to leave this open, whether the cooperation relation that we at the moment as humans that we argue exists with animals in subjecting them can actually be redeemed or not. But I don't want to see this question as answered a priori, but want to see this answered by giving animal representatives a say in lawmaking about humans and animals. And then finally, and I think this is a new element, as I said, I go back to Rawls here too, but to the Rawls of political liberalism, who explains what he calls the political relation as the inevitability not only to be under laws. I mean, we know what this means for humans because we know what the all-subjective principle spells for humans, but we are also inevitably in democratic communities exercising political power. We are, so to speak, compromised. Yeah, we cannot but exercise political power if we are citizens of a democratic community. If you want it or not, yeah, even if you never exercised your vote, if you never participated in an election, you cannot help but participate in the exercise of political power in a democracy, because the political power in a democracy is political power exercised in the name of the demos. And as long as you belong to the demos and have this participatory right, you cannot help but participate in imposing laws on others. And I want to say another strong reason for the validity of the all-subjective principle as applied to animals is humans' wish to justify their treatment of animals, especially if I'm correct in saying that humans have assumed, so to speak, voluntarily, a description of themselves as exercising political authority over animals, as legislating for animals, also in the interest of animals. Now, if humans commit to waging war on animals, then I want to say this is no longer a relevant explication of our self-understanding, but I believe that it would be wrong to assume that the self-description and self-understanding of democratic societies is thus. Okay, so this was the second important slide, and I'm looking at my watch, and I have another like 5 minutes perhaps to go through the two final slides. The one slide, okay, what do we learn of this? What do we take from it? And what I want to say is that the differential strength of reasons, a weak reason or subjective principle, is valid because animals have an interest in liberty. Strong reasons, animals have a claim to having a say in legislation because they are cooperative, they cooperate with humans, may be seen to trigger different political realizations of this having a say. So one possibility would be to interpret the weak reason, having an interest in liberty, as triggering a say in deliberation, but perhaps not in decision-making, not in parliamentary decision-making. So if you think of animal representatives in parliament, you would give them a voice, but perhaps not a vote. Now, the stronger reasons, I believe, trigger decisional inclusion. And interestingly, if you buy this distinction, then this would be equivalent to, or extensionally equivalent to, the distinction that Kimlicka and Donaldson draw between the claims of liminal animals, who they consider to be denizens, and domesticated animals, who they consider to be citizens. Citizens have a right to decisional representation, while liminal animals have a right to deliberative inclusion. Second point, does this interpretation of the all-subjective principle trigger political equality, democratic inclusion as equals for animals? I believe this is a really tough question that has not been addressed at all in the literature. And the question is, should the numbers count? And I believe that this is not necessarily the case. It is not necessarily the case that the ASB in its application to animals triggers a rule like the one individual, one vote for humans, but it may also be seen to trigger a weaker entitlement, which I call, for lack of a better word, political sufficiency for animals, not political equality. I can elaborate on that in the Q&A. And then finally, I've today only spoken about the all-subjective principle for democratic states, domestic societies. And I believe this is, of course, not enough, but what I've said today would have to be done for animal members of households, where animals are subjected, even though they are considered family members, animal inmates in farms, and of course, also the global dimension would have to be considered, cosmopolitan entitlements. Final slide. What is the takeaway message from this? I think there are 4 takeaway messages. In general, the ASB should be asymmetrically understood. One interpretation for animals, one interpretation for humans. From the bottom-up perspective, which is unfortunately the animal perspective, the principle says that those subjected are entitled to having a say if they are materially affected or affected by pervasive impact. But from the perspective of those subjecting the animals, there is more involved, namely a claim to legitimacy or political authority, and that has to be discharged somehow. Yeah, it's not the case that it's a normatively non-neutral form of coercion which we are imposing on animals, but we are imposing it with the self-understanding that we are also not only doing this to animals, but also in a sense to be teased out for animals. And so we should give them and each other reasons for doing this. Then this does not immediately trigger decisional inclusion of animal representatives in parliament, but may only trigger deliberative inclusion depending on which arguments we want to employ for the validity of the all-subjective principle so understood, which means then finally that having a say under the ASB means different things depending on the strength of the reasons for inclusion. That's it. Thanks for your interest, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.